I got seas going right across my deck here now. I did not right up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is Goose Through. Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner. I am one of your hosts today. Our other normal host will be out, but we are continuing our series on... Okay, I'm going to get the pronunciation right this time. Is it supposed to be pronounced Karluk?
Yes.
Okay.
It's tough because I've been reading about this for years. And when you say it in your head, the very, sort of the natural default for, I think, native English speakers, at least, is Karluk. But from what I understand, the indigenous pronunciation puts the emphasis on the second syllable, and it's Luke instead of look. I also kind of want to really briefly shout out my friend Kay. They have a lot more knowledge about sort of indigenous languages and pronunciations than I do. And so they've been helping me quite a bit with some of these pronunciations and trying to make sure that we're saying things correctly, which is, very important to me. And I know it's important to you too. So thank you, Kay. Your brain is indispensable.
All right. So Karluk.
That is, I think, as close as we're going to get. That is how, if you've ever watched any of the documentaries or anything that have video footage of, I guess, I don't know if I want to spoil it or not, but William Laird McKinley video footage, that's how he pronounces it, as Karluk. So we would probably be the first people to pronounce it correctly in a public forum since he died. So yay us.
So we're going to be continuing our story of the Karluk. We also, of course, have Jess back to help us through this crazy, winding, epic tale of Arctic exploration. So welcome back, Jess. How's it going?
Going great. Thank you for having me back. I'm glad that I didn't scare you off in the first episode. This is a lot of fun and continues to be a lot of fun.
It would be really embarrassing for the podcast if we released part one and then immediately deleted it and just didn't ever mention Karluk again.
Yeah.
But that's not going to happen here. We're gonna push through this, like many of the people aboard Karluk. Before we get back into the main story, all the normal housekeeping stuff, we do have two new patrons to shout out. So thank you to Jackie and Wendy for signing up on Patreon. We hope you enjoy what you find over there. Our schedule's a bit odd here, recording wise, for August because we have one of these big series. We will get the bonus episodes out as well. We've got some fun stuff planned for those. But in the meantime, we hope you enjoy the back catalog over there on Patreon, which is pretty considerable by this point. Moving on to the rest of our housekeeping stuff. So, media-wise, Jess, what have you been consuming in the week since we last spoke?
So in the week since we last spoke, I'm not entirely sure how it came up, but I was talking to my husband, Matt, and he realized that I have never actually seen the movie Highlander. I am aware of the TV series and of the kind of pop culture references, but I came home from work the other day and he was sitting there with it queued up and he's like, sit down, we're watching Highlander. So I watched Highlander, and I think it's one of those things that if you grew up with it, it would be absolutely just earth-shatteringly cool. But watching it 30 years out, they are just allergic to giving you any kind of backstory for any of this world building. And why are there immortals? I don't know. There just are. Why can there only be one? Because of reasons. Why do they have to kill each other? Just they do. So I found that very frustrating as an adult watching it. But I think that if you were a kid or a teen when it came out, this would be just about the coolest movie that you've ever seen. And I think that Clancy Brown as the villain was having a fantastic time. So I love that for him. And it was an experience.
Did he sound like Mr. Krabs in the movie?
A little bit. He had some scenery chewing.
Is that the movie? Because Christopher Lambert is in that movie, correct?
Yes.
Is that the movie where he had to learn his lines phonetically because he didn't speak English?
I believe so, yeah.
It's that or Mortal Kombat, and I forget.
I want to say it was this one. I did a little Googling after the fact, just trying to figure out what is the backstory, what is the lore with this movie, because the movie told you absolutely none of it. So I was trying to figure out how the mythology worked in this universe, and I got no answers, but I did find out about Christopher Lambert not being an English speaker, so that was an interesting little tidbit.
I mean, the culturally salient thing from Highlander, I know, is this: there can be only one. I've never seen the movie
Yes.
either, but I have used that reference plenty of times. So
Me too. I think I used it in the last episode, and I realized that I've never seen the movie, but I'm aware of it. I know that it's a part of pop culture, but I'd never actually watched the whole thing, and now I have.
I suspect that like 80% of the people who've made that reference have probably never seen the movie either. That's just like a gut feeling. But it's just one of those things that it's very easy to drop that reference and hope that no one really presses you on your knowledge of Highlander.
So aside from that, I do at my job, I do co-lead a book club, and I will be co-leading 2 book clubs starting here soon. And our book club pick for next month is Saturday Night at the Lakeside Supper Club by J. Ryan Strattle. I just started it. It's interesting being primarily a history and nonfiction reader and co-leading a library book club, which is primarily, I guess, what we call women's fiction. They tend to be kind of family stories or mysteries. Not at all what I usually read, but every once in a while it's kind of nice. And this one seems to be a kind of an interesting story set in the upper Midwest. And so hopefully I'll like it.
That kind of book seems familiar. I'm not sure if I know that one specifically. I know when I worked at Half Price Books, that kind of genre sold super, super well.
Yeah.
Let's see. Taylor is out of office, as we mentioned here. He has a good reason. He has a valid excuse. He is at Yellow Springs Pride with a few of he and his wife's friends. So that's as good a reason as any to miss out on a recording session. Hope he's having a good time.
Yeah.
I wonder if Dave Chappelle's going to be there. I'm going to guess not.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say no, but anything's possible.
Actually, he's probably in Riyadh getting ready for that Riyadh Comedy Festival. Let's see. For me, I finished Prisoners of the American Dream. A very depressing ending to the book, but a good read regardless. I started a book called Black Against Empire, The History and Politics of the Black Panther Party by Joshua Bloom and Waldo Martin Jr. I wanted something a bit more dense because we actually, in some of the upper level courses that I do with students, like especially with the really high level students where it's not even really a language class anymore, it's more of a American culture and history class to sort of prep them for university. So we talk a lot about civil rights, and a lot of them are familiar with kind of the same figures that an American high schooler would be. They know Martin Luther King Jr. They know other sorts of cultural figures like Muhammad Ali. Some of them know. I mean, my student this last term, I just had the one for most of the time. I mean, he was familiar with Malcolm X, even, which is a deeper cut, I think, for non-American students, especially like students coming out of high school. And so we got into talking about kind of the deeper story of like the Montgomery bus boycott. You think of Rosa Parks, and most Americans know Rosa Parks, and fewer Americans know, Claudette Colvin and a lot of other people involved there. So we got into that, and then we started onto sort of more militant resistance groups like the Black Panthers. And, my student was very interested in the Black Panthers as something different from what he had seen in movies. Because he had seen them depicted, in movies like Forrest Gump, where there's this sort of just across the board angry black man image of the Black Panthers. And so it was very fun to be able to talk about a lot of their public health initiatives and their free breakfast programs, in addition to the very politically grounded doctrine of being armed and ready to defend your community. So it was fun. It was fun being able to talk about that. And I was just looking for something a bit deeper from, the material I just go over in class. And yeah, it's definitely dense. It's going to be a project read. A lot of footnotes, it looks like. But anyway, I'm excited to get deeper into that as something that's definitely my heaviest read right now I'm going through.
It sounds like an interesting one, though.
Yeah, definitely. Especially like the later history, like the later years of the Black Panthers is something I'm less familiar with. It's kind of when things are sort of disintegrating and, they eventually dissolve. Yeah. So yeah, that's definitely a part I'm interested in getting further into. All right, so we're back to the Frozen North. A bit of a recap here, just a quick 1-2 minute run through. Hopefully, if you're listening to this, you did listen to part 1. I don't know why you wouldn't. By the time this is out, it will be out on the main feed for free for anyone. You should definitely pause and listen to part 1 if you haven't already. In part 1, we talked about the Canadian Arctic Expedition and some of its goals in terms of exploring north of Canada looking for new stuff to add to Canada. And I don't know if we explicitly mentioned this part. You may have at the beginning, but there was at least for Stefansson, and I'm sure for others too, there was at least the possibility that they were looking for a totally new landmass. Is that correct?
Yes. So I didn't get into Crockerland in the last episode, so I'm glad you brought that up. But this kind of goes back to when we were talking about Peary. One of the things that Peary claimed to have seen while he was up in Greenland near the area where he believed the North Pole to be was a landmass that he called Crockerland after one of his financial sponsors, I believe. And he said, well, I didn't really have time to explore it and to look into it any more deeply, but it's up there. I promise it's up there. So he gets back to the United States, and there is then a rush of people who are interested in going to Crockerland and being the first people to actually set foot on Crockerland, because Peary just said that he saw it, but he didn't actually set foot on it and didn't get to do any actual exploring of the land. But there are plenty of people who were interested in doing that, including Stefansson. Steph kind of thought that maybe he might be able to sneak up and get to Crockerland. Roald Amundsen, who was going to be kind of exploring up in that area as well. And then there was actually an expedition called the Crockerland Expedition that was sent up there that were sponsored by, I want to say, the American Geographic Society, but I'd want to double check that before you put it in the feed. They decided that they were going to get to Crockerland first, and they were a sponsored organization that was going to take all of these scientists and resources and go up there and map the land and find out more about it. And spoiler alert, they get up there and they discover that Crockerland is not real. And there's, of course, debate. Did Peary know that it wasn't real? Had he seen a shadow, or was there a mirage? That was, something that's fairly common when you're up in the Arctic, to think that you see something and be very sure that you see it, but it ends up just kind of being a trick of the light. So the question is, did Peary actually sincerely believe this, or was he just trying to look for an opportunity to maybe go back up there in the future and sort of hedge his bets? If he doesn't get to the North Pole, well, then he can still go back up to the north and he can say that he's doing it to explore Crockerland. So there's all these people that are trying to get to Crockerland, and that was an unofficial goal of the Canadian Arctic Expedition. And that was something that Bartlett and Stefansson were actually agreed on. We'll get into a little bit more of the drift of the Karluk later, but the idea was that they wanted to get up there and see if they could maybe sneak in past the other people to be the first ones to explore Crockerland.
Yeah, so that was an interesting part. I'm, always interested in this sort of era of exploration where the map is being filled in, globally, but there's still some of those blank spots where whether there could be something here that we've never seen before, that isn't on a map that we have. So, of course, we've just made a few references to the leader of the expedition, Stefansson, and the captain of the Karluk, Robert Bartlett, Bob. We talked about them a good deal. We will continue to talk about them a good deal. And we ended part one with maybe the controversial turning point of the expedition, where Stefansson has this idea that he is going to go off on a seal hunt. He takes a few people with him.
Caribou hunt, not
a seal hunt.
Yes, for no caribou.
Because we said even he would have said that, well, there's no caribou here. So he's off on this caribou hunt with a kind of a strange motley collection of people he's chosen to take with him for such a task. I know we'll talk about that just a bit later in the notes. So we will come back to Stefansson. This episode is very heavily focused on the people remaining on Karluk. We'll see how things develop. So soon after Stefansson's departure, two things happened. The first big winter storm of the season, with winds up to 60 miles per hour. And along with the storm comes some drastic changes to the landscape of the surrounding ice, with pressure ridges, some of them dozens of feet high, forming all around them. And on September 23rd, the men noticed an unmistakable change. Quoting here from the Ice Master.
The gale had gathered such force that their ice floe had broken free. As the winds picked up, the ice carried the Karluk and all of her passengers westward, 30 miles a day, far away from Herschel Island toward the heart of the Arctic Ocean. The wind was swift and strong, the sky overcast and dark. They knew that if this continued, Stefansson would have no chance of returning to the ship, since he would not be able to reach them. nor did it then seem likely that they would have any chance of setting out to reach him and the rest of the original expedition.
So all of this was kind of disorienting for me to be visualizing, because your immediate surroundings, you're kind of locked in place, but at the same time, you know that you are drifting quite a long ways, at a very fast pace. There's some brief moments here where Karluk's fortunes change and she drifts back eastward, but this overwhelming trend is that she's continuing to drift further and further west, further away from Herschel Island. This is back the way they've come, further from linking up with the rest of the expedition as planned. And now further from the leader of the expedition, since Stefansson's not there. However, it's around this time that Bartlett seems to confirm, at least to himself, that it might not matter that they're drifting away from Stefansson. He might not have been planning to come back. There's this possibility that maybe this wasn't a hunting party in the first place. We talked about the somewhat odd choice of personnel to go on a hunting party. Why doesn't he bring Karluk?
Or Karluk?
Why does he choose to bring his secretary, Burt McConnell? Not, to my knowledge, a renowned hunter.
No.
At least not compared to the indigenous hunters you have with you. Part of this got into something that I wanted to bring up, and I feel like this is as good a time as any to bring it up, is as this whole story is developing, there's kind of this ghost haunting the expedition. Other expeditions have come up here, but one in particular seems to be setting a very eerie precedent for them, and that's the expedition of the Jeanette.
Yes.
So I guess here we could say it's mentioned later that they have this library full of books and records and stuff of previous expeditions, and one of those is the Jeanette. It seems to be in some ways an eerie similarities to what's happening with Karluk. Could you just give us the quick SparkNote summary of what was the Jeanette, what happened to the Jeanette, and why would that be ominous maybe for these on the expedition?
So the Jeanette, I don't want to get too much into it because it's a fascinating story all on its own, but the Jeanette was an expedition that was trying to reach the North Pole. People have been trying to reach the North Pole for a long time. The Jeanette happened roughly 30 years before the Karluk was sailing. So they were a group of people who, under the command of a guy named George Washington DeLong, who wanted to try to reach the North Pole. And what happened to them was something very similar to what's happened to the Karluk. They are in a boat and they get frozen in and they drift. So the drift of the Jeanette followed a very similar path to the drift of the Karluk. They are going along the same path. And without spoiling too much about the Jeanette, it did not end well for the majority of the crew. It ended very, very badly for the majority of the crew. So the guys on the Karluk are trying to figure out, are we following in the path of the Jeanette? Is this the exact same pathway that they took that ended so poorly for them? And something that's kind of interesting is that McKinley supposedly discovers that before he took off for his, air quotes, hunting trip, Stefansson had been reading George Washington DeLong's account, his diary, his account of the drift of the Jeanette. So they start to put some pieces together, and the crew at least starts to wonder, did Stefansson ever intend to actually come back? Or was this something where he read the writing on the wall, he realized that we are following a very similar path to the Jeanette, and he started to see that this was not going to end well for us either? That is certainly one theory, and that is something that a lot of the crew believed. Scholars today are divided. You'll see a lot of people saying he absolutely intended to leave and he did not intend to come back. You'll see people saying, well, he left. It might not have been for a hunting party. Maybe it was for some other purpose, but he absolutely did intend to come back. And then you'll see people who will say, well, we really think that it was a hunting party and we really do think that he intended to come back. I know that the Niven and the Levy especially tend to be very firm on the idea that he did not intend to come back. But if you look at what some of the more professional historians and scholars are saying, there is some evidence that he did intend to come back, or if he did not intend to come back, he at least did not tell the people that were in his party, because most of them left a lot of their goods and a lot of their supplies on the Karluk. So you've got somebody like Wilkins, who's a professional photographer, and he left behind a lot of his very expensive cameras and camera equipment. He left it behind on the ship. You've got somebody like Janice, who's an anthropologist, who left a lot of his notes, his field notes, and a lot of his supplies on the ship. And there's this question of, if these people had known that they weren't going to be coming back, would they just leave their stuff there? Asking a scientist to leave behind all of their supplies is a pretty tough thing to ask of them. And also Stefansson left behind quite a bit of his stuff too. He was working on a language dictionary for, I believe it's Inuktitut, an Inuktitut English dictionary that he'd been working on writing, all of his field notes, all of his, a lot of his personal supplies. Burt McConnell, his secretary, left behind his big gun, his hunting rifle, and that will actually come into play quite a bit later on. But all of these very valuable supplies were left behind. And you have to think that if they never intended to come back, they would have at least made more of an effort to take more of their stuff with them.
All of those things. And I guess where I was coming down on it just from that is that it certainly never struck me that, oh, this was like a conspiracy amongst this small group to leave the ship. It's like, it definitely would seem like Stefansson, if he was planning to leave, wouldn't have told anyone that, even in his small group. And I think that's an interesting thing we can do here, because as you alluded to there, both of those book length accounts, the Ice Master and Empire of Ice and Stone, are, I don't know enough to say skewed, but they're definitely, they lean definitely towards their
sure.
They're in general pro Bartlett, anti Stefansson in yes. most situations where something could be up in the air, or maybe we just don't have any way of knowing 100% sure. I would say, just based on my readings, they tend to lean towards Bartlett when possible. They tend to lean against Stefansson when possible.
And that's easy to do. Stefansson sucks. We right. don't like Stefansson. So it's a natural impulse, I think, to say, we have this guy that we know we don't like, and it's very easy to assign the worst possible motives to him at all times. And based on a lot of the evidence that they were working with. And, I think that Empire of Ice and Stone and The Ice Master are both great books. And I think that they're fantastic reads and I really enjoy them. But also, I love that there are still scholars, people like Janice Cavell, who are working today, who are doing new scholarship, looking at the original documents and coming up with new perspectives on these events that happened, who are shedding some light on things like, well, the copy of McKinley's diary that they were working from was one that he rewrote in the 70s. And during that time, when he and Bartlett had been very close later on in life, during that time when he was rewriting his original diary, did he maybe take out some things or pad some things up to maybe make his friend and his hero, Bob Bartlett, look a little better, and to make the choices that Bartlett made look a little better, and to make Stefansson look a little worse. Not that I think Stefansson needed a lot of help looking worse. I do think that he is a bad man, but I think that when you're looking at a historical source that has been rewritten, you have to kind of start to ask, why was it rewritten? And there's a lot of questions, I think, that are raised by that. So, and I'm glad that there are scholars who are looking into that and providing us with some possible answers.
That Cavell article that you sent me, I know, gets into some of the very granular changes to some of these things. It's something as simple as this one intransitive verb construction was changed to, this passive verb construction to, maybe shift a small amount of blame from one person or away from one other person.
Sure.
So yeah, it is interesting. I think that's a cool thing doing, a history podcast where most of the topics we discuss have, one or two main sort of popular accepted sources, but there's always new scholarship developing, even on a story that seems written already.
Sure.
History changes, as you said, with going back and, when something like a journal is edited and re-released, it's like, are you also editing your memory of what happened here to fit however you might feel about something now?
Yeah. And not to mention that just when you're looking at events that happened a long time ago, if I'm looking at things that happened to me 25 years ago, I'm not going to remember them as well as if I was writing about something that happened a year ago. Your memory changes just as time goes by. You remember things differently, especially when you have a really strong, affection for somebody, or you have, I don't know, I guess I've noticed myself doing this a few times. My dad passed away a few years ago, and I had a great relationship with my dad and we were very close, but I've noticed that there were things that I remember being annoyed about him at the time that now I remember. And it's like, oh, my sainted father has never done anything wrong. And obviously that's not true. It's just when you love someone, or when you care about somebody and you want to remember the positives, that kind of changes how you remember whole events sometimes too.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's crazy what the passage of time can do to, your perception of what was happening. So of their situation, Bartlett would write, "A nice mess. Stefansson, the leader, ashore in his whole blooming expedition, floating around here in the ice out of sight of land. It certainly would have been embarrassing for Stefansson if the Premier of Canada had met him on the beach about that time and said, 'Sir, where's your expedition?' The only thing Stefansson could have answered would have been to have waved his arm out over the polar pack and said nonchalantly, 'They're out there waiting for me, sir,' which we were. We were waiting for him all right. We were stuck so hard and fast in that ice, 40 feet thick, that all the motor trucks in Canada couldn't have pulled us out." That quote jumped out at me because with a lot of these polar expeditions, I tend to visualize them as older than they are.
Mm-hmm.
As taking place in, like the 1800s. And then you get a quote like this where he's referring to motor trucks. But the fact that he has to call them motor trucks also sort of places it as, oh, this is something, a decent time away in the past.
And I like this quote because Bob Bartlett is a very descriptive writer. He wrote his own account of the sinking of the Karluk later on, and he's a very descriptive writer. He did have a co-writer for a lot of it. I don't think that he's, naturally a great writer like somebody like McKinley, but that 40 feet thick, I think, was really was really helpful in visualizing just how much ice there was, because you can say, oh, they're stuck in the ice, but what does that actually look like? So I love the kind of the numbers and just the heavy on the description in that quote too.
Yeah, I think especially when like the majority of people who deal with ice, even in a place that does get very cold, parts of the northern United States, parts of Canada, when you've dealt with ice, it has been nothing close to that concentration of ice. I mean, here in Wisconsin, an inch of ice that's a lot of ice buildup, if you're
Also here in Ohio, that's a lot.
Dozens of feet of ice building up. And you really do get a better idea of how easy it would be for that ice to crush a ship if it decides to. So he refers to, us waiting out there on the ice. Now is probably a good time for a rundown of who is left, who's the us in that quote. So in part one, we included a list of the scientific staff on the Karluk, but we really only made passing reference to a few of the actual crew who are actually manning the ship. So we have Bob Bartlett, of course, the captain. He's been a main character. He will continue to be. I think we only mentioned two other crew members in part one. One of them was John Monroe, the chief engineer, one of the many Scots on board.
Yeah, one of the many Scots and the many M names.
Yes, both confusing. Let's see. He's the one who refers to the engine as an old coffee pot, and that's kind of what his job is making sure the engine is running. We also mentioned Fred Maurer, one of the firemen. Just as a reminder to all of our listeners, we are dealing with a steamship here, so a fireman is not a guy who puts out fires, but rather a guy who keeps one very important fire going, or sometimes multiple very important fires going. Sometimes referred to as a stoker, I know, in other situations.
Usually in the Royal Navy, you'll hear them referred to as stokers instead of firemen.
Coming from a non-maritime context, fireman is a bit of a confusing name.
It is, yes.
I guess much closer to a fireman from Fahrenheit 451 in that sense.
Yes. Got to keep the fires burning.
We've got Alexander Anderson. He is one of the Scots, right?
He is, yes.
In classic Scot fashion, he goes by Sandy. He's the first officer. Is that right? Is he only 22?
He's only 22. He was a replacement. The first officer that was originally hired I think I alluded to this, maybe not in the first episode. Bartlett was not the original captain of the Karluk. It was a guy named Theodore Peterson, and he was somebody who just could not get along with Steph. They disagreed over the terms of the expedition, so they parted ways, and that's when Stefansson invited Bartlett to come on as master after he and Peterson had already parted ways. Well, Sandy Anderson was, I think, just an able seaman. I'm not sure, or maybe he was a mate. I don't exactly remember, but he was not first officer. The original first officer, Bartlett had dismissed as being unsuited for the expedition. A lot of these guys had a lot of problems. They were kind of inexperienced. A lot of them struggled with substance abuse. There's a lot of drinking. There was a lot of just sort of unsavory behavior among the crew. And the original first officer, Bartlett, just said absolutely not. And so he brought up Sandy Anderson to replace him. So he was very young, but he had a decent amount of experience on the ship, and he proved to be a pretty competent first officer, I think.
We've got Charles Barker, second officer. We've got Robert Williamson, second engineer. John Brady, a seaman in his 20s. We've got George Breddy, another fireman. We've got Ernest Chafe, known as Charlie, the mess room boy. And then we have an interesting guy who I didn't really know anything deeper about him until your notes you've added here. A man of many names in the writing about this. So written here as Edmund Lawrence Golightly, or Ned, but also given the name Archie King. So he's a seaman in his 20s. Can you tell us about this mystery man?
I can. This is something that is mentioned in the Cavell article also, but I also did some digging on Ancestry.com. If you're a history enthusiast, an Ancestry subscription is very valuable for situations like this. I found that he was originally kind of a rich kid, kind of a posh boy, went to a very, wealthy British public school and had this very posh pedigree, but he really wanted to go to sea. So he was friends with a guy by the name of Archie King, and they switched their seaman papers because Archie King had a lot more experience, and Golightly would not have had enough experience on his own with his background and kind of getting started late to go on an expedition like this. So he took on the persona of Archie King and took his papers and enlisted under that name and with that pedigree. And I'm sure he would go on to regret that. But yeah, that is how he got to be on the Karluk.
This is presumably before any sort of photo ID is available.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Now your Royal Navy, your papers did give a rough description. So it would say this person is 5'7" with brown hair and blue eyes. It would not go into any great detail, but it would talk about hair color, eye color, height, weight, skin color, if you have any tattoos or distinguishing marks, but it's not going to have a photo. So you could definitely fudge it.
And like, as we saw in the Mutiny on the Globe, talking about some of these physical descriptions could be super wide ranging for people who basically have the same sort of background. So this is back in the day when you could still do that. You could just trade papers with a buddy and you could become him for a little bit. Let's see. We've got Stanley Morris, another fireman. We've got Robert Templeman, the cook/steward.
Actually, Stanley Morris was a seaman, not a fireman.
Not a fireman. The opposite of a fireman.
He was just able seaman.
Stanley Morris, a seaman, age 21. We've got Robert Templeman, the cook/steward, age 29. We've got Hugh Williams, known as Clam, another seaman. And
that the nickname Clam came about because he was very, very soft-spoken and very rarely spoke. He was a quiet, kind of a bigger guy, very quiet, didn't really say much. So they joked that his name was Clam because he never spoke. So he was shut up like a clam.
When we talk about idioms with my students in language class, I don't do a lot. I feel like as a language teacher, explicitly studying idioms is really not that fruitful of a pursuit. They just kind of come up as they come. But whenever we talk about them, my students always love the English phrase happy as a clam because they don't understand it at first. And then you like pull up a picture and the clam is just like, and they're like, oh, I love it. That's so cool.
He's smiling.
Yeah. So awesome. And then also listed here, I guess, is he technically a member of the crew? Is
sort of
Jack Hadley.
He did eventually do some carpentering, so he
Yeah.
did have some duties, but his original intent was just to be a passenger. But then as they started getting stuck, they realized Hadley has the skill set, so we're going to put it to use.
We need to make this crew 10% more racist. So you are
That's
officially
right.
signed on.
And he was just the man to do that.
So yes, Jack Hadley, he brings his skills as a carpenter. He's age 57 again, so we could pseudo call him a member of the crew because
close enough.
He does end up contributing, quite a bit to some of the things they need. So with these ice conditions growing more dangerous around the Karluk by the first week of October, this is October 1913.
Yes.
Bartlett started to plan for the increasingly likely possibility of losing the ship. We know that he does not have a great opinion of the durability of Karluk. He definitely doesn't believe it's going to survive a winter locked in the ice. So he starts taking some steps to begin the construction of, I think, 2 Peary sleds. A few improvements over a more traditional style sled here. So why these might be useful. These are sleds. These have 13-foot lengths of hardwood, about 3 inches wide as the runners. The undersides of those are lined with steel, obviously to make them glide better across the ice. They have beds built from softer wood, and all of this is actually lashed rather than nailed or screwed together using seal skin to give it more flexibility. I thought that was interesting, sort of location-specific carpentry of we need this thing to be flexible as it's going over the ice, which is not always uniform, of course, in its structure. Anything else we should know about the Peary sled?
Not really. Something that Bartlett mentions is that it's able to turn around without unloading all of the supplies off of it. So that's another advantage for situations where you're doing a lot of hauling things back and forth. Just makes it a little bit more maneuverable. But Peary was actually very good on the logistical end of things. He might have been kind of a nightmare person to work for and with, but he was a very good planner, and he was very good at the kind of nuts and bolts logistics kinds of things and planning for the expedition, making sure that all the food supplies were in order, making sure that the sleds and everything were as efficient as possible. So Bartlett did have the advantage of knowing that this type of sled was going to be more effective in the conditions that they were going to be going into, as opposed to the traditional, either the kind of traditional Western style sled or even the traditional indigenous style of sled.
I think that's one of the appeals of reading some of these polar exploration accounts, North and South Pole, is that the consequences of failure are extremely harsh. You and all your men could die. And so a lot of these people it really behooves them to truly study what the people who came before did and what worked and what didn't. Saying this is why we should build this kind of sled. This is why we shouldn't try to use. Did someone try to use horses or mules?
Yeah. Well, okay. So there were a couple different expeditions that tried to use ponies at the South Pole. I think Shackleton was actually the first to take ponies on the Nimrod expedition. And then Robert Falcon Scott took them whenever he made his run at the South Pole. And people like to give Scott a lot of crap for this. They like to say, oh, that idiot took ponies. Why would you ever think that was okay? Well, Shackleton did it first. And Shackleton had some degree of success with the ponies. Again, we didn't, humans didn't know what would work in the South Pole or in Antarctica specifically, because there were no indigenous people down there. There's just ice, and we had no idea what was going to be successful. So if you saw that somebody else had done something and it had kind of worked for them, then you'd be inclined to do that. So I know that when we hear that today, that they tried to take horses to the South Pole, it's just kind of an instant eye roll on, who would think that was a good idea. But really, with the information that they had, the decisions that they made were them doing the best they could with the information they had, even when the information they had wasn't very good.
That's, I think, the really fascinating part of especially with the South Pole, like you said, because there's no one there to copy. There's no one there to learn from.
No.
The penguins aren't that helpful.
Only for morale purposes are the penguins helpful. Morale and food, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in that sense, it is nice if you're at the South Pole knowing that the biggest animal you might see is a big emperor penguin, or maybe an elephant seal or something. But I mean,
yeah, around the coast, you're going to have seals and penguins. But as you get in further towards the actual South Pole, there is nothing.
The elephant seal is, big and scary, but it's not gonna come into your camp in the middle of the night and
No,
eat you all in your sleep like a polar bear might. So
it is not a polar bear.
so let's see, what else do we have here? So Bartlett, he delegates the task to McKinley of packing bags full of long underwear, fur clothing, food, and other supplies arranged along the railing of the ship where they can be easily tossed overboard if and when the situation arose. So he has McKinley making bug out bags, basically, for
Yes.
just, the very likely event that they won't be able to stay on the ship. So I was interested in this, and when you mentioned this in your note, I did vaguely remember this from Madhouse at the End of the Earth. So Bartlett sort of somewhat, I don't know how much or how seriously, flirts with the idea of using dynamite to blast their way out of this ice, but he doesn't end up pursuing this because they're too far from open water. The idea that they'd have to use way too much, I'm assuming, to blow through all of this ice.
Yeah, and it's not going to be as effective as they think it will be, because the ice, as cold as it is, the ice is almost immediately going to come back together and freeze in that spot where you just blew it up. So
I had seen this, and I had asked in the notes, are there instances where this has worked? I'm curious because I have the cartoonish image in my head of just standing on the bow of your ship and just Looney Tunes style tossing dynamite and just blowing yourself a hole through the ice. So was this a tried and true strategy that had worked in some situations?
It had contributed towards the Belgica being freed. I am not a Belgica expert. If you ever want to do an episode about the Belgica, I can hook you up with some people. But I also did read Madhouse, and I've read a few of their other sources, and they did use dynamite. They also thought that they'd just be able to blow their way out of the ice, and it doesn't quite work like that. But they did use quite a bit of dynamite, and eventually they were able to free themselves. And I think that having maybe loosened some of that ice with all of that dynamite, because if I remember correctly, they used quite a bit, that probably helped when they eventually were able to kind of use the saws and saw their way out of the ice and free the ship that way. I think that having the ice be thinner and looser from all of the dynamite probably helped. But again, I'm not a Belgica expert, so please, someone who is a Belgica expert, fact check me on that, because I don't have my book in front of me.
Yeah, that certainly sounds like the more fun way to get out of the ice, instead of just waiting for the leads to open up. So while the Karluk was locked in the ice within sight of Point Barrow, Alaska, the conditions outside prevented any attempts to reach land by dog sled or by boat. So since they'd be remaining on board for the foreseeable future, you got to find some way to fill that time productively. It is interesting anytime we have one of these stories where you sort of ostensibly have a ship that is being run, with a crew and everything, and then something happens where the crew can't really follow the normal routines you would typically have on a ship. In this case, they're not going anywhere. So what do you do to fill that time? And there's a lot of cool stuff they get up to in this time. One area they get to is science. I was very interested in the dredging and depth sounding going on here. And I believe Murray is mostly responsible for this.
Yeah, James Murray was a very noted oceanographer before he got on the Karluk. So he was really excited by the possibility of being able to study kind of never before studied animal life. So he's doing all of this dredging, and he is collecting specimens and taking notes and just having a great time.
The specimens that he's pulling up here, I think later I added a bit more about this. But yeah, like you said, this is cool. This is, potentially they're maybe the first people who've been able to study this in this way, where they want to collect and document what kind of things they're finding in the water. We've got music, of course. I know they have some gramophones. They have some records on board. They've got some instruments. There's always singing, of course.
And if I can interject a minute, I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Mackay, who I think is one of the most interesting people on the expedition. Dr. Mackay is a fascinating character to me because he, we kind of today remember him as this guy who argued with Bartlett and was kind of arrogant and obnoxious and difficult to get along with. But if you read the Karluk Chronicle, the sad attempt that they made at doing a shipboard newspaper for the first couple weeks that they were at sea, he's very funny. He was very funny on the Nimrod. He was had a reputation as kind of a jokester, a really interesting guy. I have a lot of empathy for Mackay because he did struggle with alcoholism most of his life. And we actually have letters that he wrote to his friend Putty Marston, who was on the Nimrod with him, from an alcohol treatment facility at the time. So he'd really been struggling with addiction, and I think Shackleton had reached out to Stefansson and encouraged him to take Mackay on board to hopefully, get him back to the Arctic or get him back to the polar regions and hopefully snap him out of this and kind of help him to sober up. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. Unfortunately, he did find alcohol and he did find drugs on board the ship. And one of his favorite songs was a Harry Lauder record about getting drunk. It was called Something in the Bottle for the Morning. And he would play that song on their Victrola over and over and over, like a toddler playing Baby Shark, that kind of thing. And the rest of the crew was so sick of hearing this song. But every single time he heard it, it was like the funniest thing that had ever happened to him in his entire life. And so there were sometimes fights over the Victrola and over taking the Victrola away from Dr. Mackay so that he couldn't play that song anymore. So you can imagine that there was a lot of situations like that, just when you're in close quarters with people fighting over the music. I mean, that happens today on a road trip, fighting over who gets the aux cord. It's no different. So I think that that kind of shows that I like to highlight the human side of some of these guys too, and just getting annoyed with your buddy because he keeps playing the same stupid song over and over again is a universal experience. We've all been there.
I think also talking about sort of what connections you can draw here. I think that is really interesting with Shackleton and his relationship with Mackay. It seems like almost sort of knowing that if this guy doesn't have Arctic stuff to do, he's going to go right back to he's going to go back to drinking. And I do think it's interesting, and I find it very relatable. Like, as someone who, like, I struggled a lot with alcohol and have gotten that, under control the last few years. But I think there is sometimes that sense that, well, I can do this thing instead of drinking. Mm-hmm. And it does very quickly, I mean, in my experience, it does very quickly get subsumed into, I can do this along with drinking. This can become part of it. I'm going to combine these two things. So yeah, like the idea here that yes, he is back doing the thing that he should be doing, the thing that's going to get him enthusiastic about something, and sort of just bringing that along with him. Is Mackay also the one who is using strychnine?
Yes.
Strychnine is one of those things that I associate with like old timey poisonings. Like if you were gonna slip something in someone's drink, you might use strychnine with the right dose. And so yeah, it was interesting seeing that. I knew that, like many poisons, it has a medical application, just like arsenic does. And so it's interesting reading that and them trying to sort of reconstruct, what was he actually using the strychnine for? Was this a bounce back from was it opium?
It was used as a stimulant, a central nervous stimulant.
Okay.
So if you had somebody who had, maybe their heart wasn't beating quite right, they would give you strychnine to try to get your heart working the way it should be. It could sometimes also be used for stimulating breathing and circulation, or as a digestive aid, because it was thought to stimulate gastric secretions and appetite. But what it ended up being used for was a thing to use to get high in the absence of alcohol. When they ran out of the medicinal alcohol, and I believe they did have some opium and some other painkillers, and the strychnine was being used once those things were no longer available. So, and it's.
I know that in one of them it mentioned the possible use of it as someone who was, had been on an opium kick, using it to bounce back. And I was thinking, man, you are just really playing fast and loose with the human body there.
Yeah.
Like
it's, I don't want to get into what happens to Mackay yet, but let's just say that Mackay, with the way that he was playing fast and loose with some of these substances, would not have been long for this world, regardless of what the outcome of this expedition was, because you just can't keep doing that to your heart and expect it to continue functioning. But I know from just reading in some other areas, one of the other areas that I'm interested in is sort of the history of Christianity. And I know that when people talk about Appalachian snake handlers and people in the South who will sometimes, handle snakes and drink poison as part of their religious practice, a lot of times strychnine is the poison that they're drinking for that. So it's not immediately going to kill you. It's not like drinking a bunch of arsenic or rat poison or something. It's definitely playing Russian roulette, though.
Let's see here. So we've got some science happening. We have some substance abuse happening. We talked music. We sort of mentioned some of these inspirational stories of prior expeditions that hopefully won't happen to us, but it's good to be familiar with them. We talked about the Jeanette expedition. We've already sort of covered that and sort of what that was. And I do think going back to that very briefly, mentioning that as kind of is that maybe evidence that shows what Stefansson was thinking if he was reading these accounts before they left. Was this influencing his decisions? I do think it's also worth noting here, not to spoil any potential Jeanette discussions in the future, is that he's reading those accounts from George Washington DeLong, and George Washington DeLong does not survive that expedition.
He does not.
I do kind of have to wonder, is Stefansson reading this and thinking, is someone going to be reading my diary like this one day if I don't survive?
Sure. And I mean, the tidbit that he was reading the story of the Jeanette, that comes from McKinley. And that comes from, I believe, the later version of McKinley's journal. So I don't know that I would necessarily bank on that being 100% accurate or 100% the reason that he did decide to leave. But that book was being passed around the entire crew. Everybody was reading a Jeanette story just because, they were taking readings. They knew roughly where they were in location to where the Jeanette was, and they knew the path of the drift of the Jeanette, and they could see that they were starting to follow that same path. So it was common knowledge among the crew that what the fate of the Jeanette was, and that DeLong did not survive, and the majority of the crew of the Jeanette did not survive. So I can see how they would be very anxious about that, as I think any of us would be. And I think that whether or not Stefansson had actually been reading that book right before he departed, he was certainly aware of what happened to the Jeanette and what happened to DeLong.
Yeah, I feel like that certainly makes it a bit more cinematic. To say, oh, this is such a huge influence on him. But obviously the reality is maybe we'll never know.
And that's what's so frustrating with a lot of these things, a lot of these factors. Like, will we ever know why Stefansson left? Probably not. I mean, he stuck to the story that it was a hunting expedition his whole life, and the crew certainly had their own opinions, and scholars can go back to the primary sources and try to tease out some of the implications, but ultimately we don't know what was going through his head at the time, and what he was actually thinking versus what he wrote down versus what he told people may be completely different stories. So ultimately, it's frustrating that there is no definitive answer here.
But it does make for better podcasting material.
It does, absolutely. It's a great story.
So another thing, I'm very interested in language. So I was interested to see kind of some of the language activity going on here, because obviously we have a bunch of at least primarily English speakers, and then of course we have indigenous members of the expedition as well. So McKinley, Beauchamp, and Mackay, they're taking some language lessons from Kadaktovik. And I know at least one of the books refers to it as Inupiaq. And I know also in other sources, like you've mentioned here, Stuart Janice refers to it as Inuktitut.
Yes.
So I know that those are both Inuit languages, and I know that it might not be 100% determined what his native language was.
I know specifically that Stuart Janice says that Dr. Mackay was taking Inuktitut languages from Kadaktovik. I don't know all the specifics of which specific indigenous group all of the members of the expedition were from. It is possible that they were not originally from the same group because they did not live in the same, location. They were kind of picked up at different points of the expedition. So it's possible there could be more than one indigenous language at work here.
Right.
I don't know, and I would defer to somebody who's much more knowledgeable about indigenous languages than me. But I do know that Stuart Janice specifically says that Dr. Mackay took Inuktitut lessons from Kadaktovik. And there may be other expedition members who took different, who learned a slightly different indigenous language from a different member.
I know part of that is pragmatic. They can learn a lot from knowing these native languages, and they can get a bit more about the area, hunting, things like that. if you know a bit of the native language. And of course, competition. This was maybe my favorite part of the story, is as they're locked in the ice, you got to find fun stuff to do. One of the things that ends up happening is they end up having a chess tournament.
Mm-hmm.
And Mayman makes some sort of comment in the neighborhood of, well, there's no chance I can win, but I can help the winners smoke the cigars. They have a box of 50 cigars they're going to give away to the winner. I thought it was interesting. These cigars were originally intended as a gift from Stefansson to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police at Herschel Island. So the winner of this chess tournament is going to get 50 cigars. And lo and behold, turns out Mayman is a bit of a hustler when it comes to chess, because he wins the tournament. Turns out he was a bit more experienced than we expected. This is the Norwegian version of White Men Can't Jump, except it's Norwegians can't castle. Norwegians can't checkmate. I don't know. So he wins the box of cigars, and I forget who comes in second and gets the consolation prize of, is it Mackay?
Mackay. The one that he beat is Dr. Mackay, who was a known excellent chess player. So he was fully expecting to win. And he was pretty unhappy when he lost to Mayman, who, at least according to Mayman, was a total novice, did no idea what he was doing. And he somehow manages to win the whole thing. So that was pretty funny.
Very cool. Good for Mayman. Let's see. So some other stuff here. I didn't add this to my part of the notes, but I think throughout this a running theme, and it kind of goes along with the somewhat slapdash thrown together nature of the expedition, is pretty much the whole time it seems like they're having to work on something as simple as clothing, sewing this clothing to prepare for whether that's just day-to-day stuff or, if they have to leave the ship, what kind of stuff are they going to need? And I'm just fascinated by the fact that this relatively late in the game, they're already out there on the ice, locked in. They're still having to make clothes.
Yeah, they had very, very little indigenous fur clothing made for them. The idea was that they were all supposed to have a set of fur clothing that they would wear, and that was why they wanted to hire native seamstresses to assist with the making of these fur clothes. But by the time, this late in the game, they're stuck up there. They only have one native seamstress, Karluk or Auntie, and they realize that there's absolutely no way, even if she worked 24/7, that she can make fur clothes for all of these men. So some of the crew started learning how to sew and learning how to put together fur suits of clothing. So that was probably something they were not expecting to have to do. If things had been planned better, there would have been more seamstresses, and they certainly would have had a better start, and they wouldn't have been trying to, at the last possible minute, make enough clothing for everybody on the ship. But that is another weakness of the expedition. It was not well planned, and there were not enough supplies in place.
So during this time, yes, they are, they're having some fun. They're passing the time productively. But also, of course, anytime you get this kind of situation, there's going to be pockets of discontent among some of the crew, some of the personnel of the expedition. And most notably, this comes from Murray and Dr. Mackay. So both of these are veterans of Shackleton's Nimrod expedition. They have experience. They've been in situations like this before. They kind of know what to expect. And I assume they probably know what they would do if they were in charge, and they probably have opinions about that. And probably also comparing to what would Shackleton do if Shackleton was in charge? If only Shackleton were here, what would we be doing instead? Which it's a hard, I feel like as a polar explorer, that's a hard person to have to be compared to.
Yeah.
They begin devising a plan to sort of jump ship and head for land, banking on being able to survive on their own long enough to get back to safety. And they're fairly easily able to get Beauchamp to join in. It seems like he would probably agree to anything he thought would get him home faster.
Beauchamp is a fascinating character to me. He is a very well-respected anthropologist, and he was really excited by the prospect of going to the Arctic and doing field work, but he is not a physically strong man. He's very quiet, very reserved. Whenever they talk about the scientists not pitching in to help the crew do their work. Beauchamp is usually kind of the example that comes up of the guy who just refuses to do any of it. He's very fearful and very meek. And if you are striking out for land, I can't imagine the kind of guy that would really add a lot of value to your party. But he was very critical of Bartlett and of Stefansson. So that, I think, is why he got hooked up with Mackay and Murray. And just the fellowship of them being, the three senior scientists on board at the time. So they kind of feel like it's them versus Bartlett in a sense. So you want to stick together with the people that kind of share the same role as you do.
I do feel an affinity for Beauchamp because I feel like he's the most similar to how I would behave if I was on this expedition. He's not always depicted as particularly admirable necessarily, but he's definitely the person I would be if I found myself here.
Yeah, and I mean he's brilliant. He's a brilliant scientist, and I feel an affinity with Beauchamp because he brought 100 books with him to the Arctic. You've recently moved. You know what a nightmare it is to move books. There is nothing worse than having to move books from one place to another, and he brought 100 with him for an expedition, not even to his new home, just on a ship to travel. So I can see myself doing something very similar and similarly impractical. So I do have a lot of empathy for Beauchamp. I think that too, I've been interested in this for so long that I can find empathy for all of these guys. They're all kind of special in their own unique way. So I can find nice things to say about pretty much everybody except Steph. Nothing good to say about him.
Well, that's the thing. I know there's the old saying that familiarity breeds contempt, but I feel like in doing a lot of these, reading about a lot of these stories, the opposite is true when you're coming across people in this form, when you're looking at, their records and what other people have said about them. Even the people who have fairly bad reputations, you can find stuff there. I mean, I noticed it in the Globe series where we were talking about the figure of Comstock and how he's a murderous psychopath.
Yeah.
But you kind of read more back and he's like, okay, well, I see at least how he got this way, maybe. I see at least there's some off-ramps here where it didn't have to be like this.
And that's something that I love about looking at history this way, because anybody can tell you what happened, but I want to know what made Comstock into the murderous psychopath. That's what I think is really interesting. And that's what I think that, you and Taylor do such a great job of here, not to gloat, but I do think you do a fantastic job of telling the whole story, not just here's what happened, but here's why that happened.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. That makes us both feel good. What do we have here? So we have recruited / I don't know, had Beauchamp kind of foisted upon them in their attempts to leave the ship, or discussions of leaving the ship. You mentioned that Beauchamp maybe not the first guy you would choose if you were trying to strike out across the ice to safety.
Mm-hmm.
He might not bring a lot in terms of survival skills, and just he's the guy you've got to keep alive. But Mayman would be someone good to have with you, but he's a lot harder to convince to join in on this conspiracy.
The conspirators quietly approached and invited Mayman to join them. His skill on snow and ice and his stamina would be helpful, but the assistant topographer cut them off, sharply responding that it was mutiny and he'd have none of it. His allegiance was with Captain Bartlett, he told them. And as long as there are provisions on board and a deck on the Karluk, I stay on board. Before I leave the Karluk, I would rather die, for then I will at any rate save my honor.
I got distracted because Katie was carrying Wilkie around like a baby.
Oh, that's a valid distraction. I have to keep the door closed because if my animals come in here, I will immediately become distracted and you will get nothing good out of me.
I've had to here. For some reason at this apartment, Wilkie loves to come in here and just like flail around in my computer cords. He never did it at the old apartment, but he just loves doing it in here for some reason. So that was out of Empire of Ice and Stone. Time is progressing. We're at the end of October now, 1913. And some shifts in the ice mean that all of the gear that was being stored out on the ice needs to be hauled back on board. It sounds frustrating. I'm sure it was not the most fun thing to have to do.
No.
But compared to losing all of that equipment potentially, that is better.
And Bartlett was very smart in terms of knowing that you need to keep these guys busy, because if you let them sit around and stew and just let them, give them too much downtime, then they're going to catastrophize, and it's not going to be good. So it's good that, we're coming up with reasons to keep everybody busy, keep everybody moving, so that there's less time to sit around and, foment rebellion.
And I think that's an interesting thing you could draw back to the globe, is that sort of mutinous sentiment stews even in a tropical paradise. So it's probably only more accelerated, those feelings, when you're in, such a harsh environment where you can't even enjoy the sunshine, going outside. You can't even really relax, in the way that you typically would. So they need to get all this stuff back on. This includes the 30 sled dogs, which is kind of a wild card that I forget about when we're doing this, but the whole time they're having to deal with these sled dogs. And I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here, but these sled dogs, they're not bred to be nice.
No.
And cuddly.
These are not pet dogs.
These are big, mean dogs.
With one exception. There is one exception, and that is a dog by the name of Molly. And Molly is Hadley's pet. So whenever Hadley comes on board, he brings his pet dog, Molly. Now, Molly is a sled dog. She can pull the sled, but she is much more friendly and lovable. The rest of the sled dogs are just sort of mean and aggressive, and really just sort of you have to manage them. You can't really cuddle them, but you have to, they're working dogs, and you have to make sure that you're channeling their energy and getting them the things that they need so that they can be working dogs. But you're not going to bring them in and cuddle with them at all.
Kind of beyond even just the fact that, these aren't your cuddly dogs, is the fact that sometimes they'll just, randomly choose one to all gang up on. I know there's that one event where one of them ends up being killed. And these are so vicious that, the guys really just have to kind of let that happen, because it's literally too dangerous to jump in and try to stop this.
Yeah, there's some really awful, animal cruelty type situations that you run across when you read about polar exploration, and sled dogs rarely have a happy fate. It's rare for there to be a positive ending for a sled dog in a polar exploration story. But in situations like the Karluk, some of the dogs do survive, but it's a very hard existence for them, and they're always fighting amongst each other, fighting over food. If one of them has puppies, it's very common that they will, kill the puppies. It's very nasty.
We have this to kind of always sort of have in the back of your mind. They're continuing to drift north and west. And at this point, around this time, is when we start to get some problems with leaks in the forward section of the ship. This leads to them having to manually pump out these compartments, taking shifts of 2 to 3 hours to man these pumps. This is also not warm water that's leaking into the ship.
No.
Maybe thinking of the template from the Jeanette, Bartlett is making a plan to preserve the ship as long as possible by lightening her. Anything he can do to avoid actually getting crushed and having the ship sink. So he's able to identify a particularly solid, secure patch of older ice where he wants to deposit these supplies. Of course, the men have just carried all this stuff off the ice, brought it on board, and now it's going to all go back off. So again, it's keeping them busy. It's a project, but it's also has this practical purpose of, we need to make the ship lighter, and we need to have some stuff staged in case we need to dip out if the ship starts to sink.
Sure.
By lightening the ship, the idea is hopefully this will raise the ship in the water, and as much as possible have the ship sort of rise above the ice rather than being grabbed and crushed by the ice. I know that was I was reading a bit about the what was the ship called? The Fram?
The Fram, yes.
All I really remember is that it had been sort of intentionally designed for overwintering, in the sense that it was designed to sort of rise up in the ice. And I don't know if that was just the shape of the hull.
Yeah, the Fromm had kind of a rounded hull so that whenever the ice starts to push in, instead of pushing in and crushing the ship just kind of goes up above the ice. And so whenever Nansen and then later Amundsen were up in the Arctic in winter, they knew that they were going to be frozen in and they knew that they were going to be stuck in the ice. So their goal was to kind of get frozen in and drift. And because if your ship is in good enough shape that it can survive being frozen into the ice, you can drift sort of indefinitely. And they know enough about the currents to know roughly where they're going to end up. So you might not be able to sail under your own power somewhere, but you can get frozen in and drift there if there's somewhere you're looking to go in the Arctic.
Which is a cool example of sort of allowing the conditions to dictate your methods rather than sort of beating your head against the wall by simply trying to do other methods more, not simply reinforcing and strengthening the hull of a ship. You're going to be in situations where there's no strengthening you can do to this wooden vessel that is going to protect you from thousands of tons of ice crushing you from all sides. So instead, let's play by the rules of the situation we're in, and let's ride this out, sort of, get above the ice rather than trying to fight it.
The Norwegian polar explorers were exceptionally good at this, at playing by the rules of the polar regions instead of trying to impose their own views on how things should be. So when you see Norwegians going to the polar regions, you see them adapting indigenous survival techniques. You see them wearing furs. You see them doing things like building ships like the Fromm that are going to play with the ice instead of against it. So they tend to have a little bit of a better track record than the English or even the Americans in terms of playing by the rules of the region that they're visiting instead of trying to make things go the way that they think they ought to.
This supply depot they're building up on the ice, so they've got all kinds of stuff. They got coal, fish, alcohol, biscuit, molasses, gasoline, dried eggs, beef, sledges, coal stoves, wood stoves, and so much more. So with this offloading, the Karluk actually is able to rise about 2 feet in the water. Bartlett also, this is something I hadn't really thought about up to this point, but he's planning ahead for all possible contingencies, and he actually has them train on a fire drill routine. I believe this involved having sort of stationed patches of snow available, in various places so that those were available to douse any sort of fire that breaks out. As is often the case here, the last thing probably you want on a ship is a fire.
Correct.
This is no different. Even though they're in a different quote unquote sailing situation, you still don't want that. By this point, it's early to mid-November. It's about 2 months since Stefansson and the hunting party had left. And you mentioned, I believe it was Mayman you mentioned in part 1 as being a sort of the emo kid of the expedition, and
our resident sad boy. Yes,
a little bit of that here, where they're hanging out, they're smoking, I assume they're playing cards, listening to music, and the topic of Stefansson comes up, and it seems to be a fairly lighthearted, employees criticizing their boss while they're out type thing. And then Mayman comes in and he says, if I were in his position under such circumstances, I believe I would spend a bullet on myself. We were goofing around, and then Mayman comes in. And maybe everyone was thinking it, but he's the one who said it.
He's the one who said it. And his diary is full of things like that, where people might have been joking and laughing, but then he's going to make it deadly serious. He was not known for his sense of humor. As far as I can tell, he was not the resident funny guy. And some of that may have been kind of a language barrier because, of course, he was a Norwegian and native Norwegian speaker, and most of the rest of the crew are speaking English. So I don't know if some of that just didn't translate, but he will often come in and just say something extremely serious, like, well, I would spend a bullet on myself. And everybody's like, well, it's not funny anymore. So
it sounds more natural in Norwegian. We say it all the time.
Maybe.
So that's fun. Yeah, total third person, distant from it. It's hilarious that he would say that there. Probably not at the time.
It's very funny.
Probably wouldn't have been.
No.
At the time. On November 11th, this is when they see the last of the sun that they're going to get for quite some time here. There's an interesting thing here where just due to the tricks of the light in the polar regions, they do see a bit of sunlight refracted for a couple more days, but then it's gone. They are not going to get sun for months now. I was interested here in McKinley's little fitness routine that he devises.
Yeah.
He wants to stay fit. And this is not, we talked a bit about scurvy in part 1 and sort of contemporary knowledge of health, and that's connected obviously with fitness. And this is not really a time where I think of fitness as being a thing. I know it's starting to develop really as something that people do, knowing that when you can stay fit, you can stay healthy by running. But still, this seems a bit early for someone to really be like a jogger, a runner. I don't really think of 1913 as people doing this, but McKinley, he's got this sort of track that he lays out that goes around / through the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And so he finds out that 10 laps on his route gives him a mile, so he can sort of track his fitness that way. I thought that was really cool. And
also McKinley is a school teacher by trade. So he's a math and science teacher from Glasgow. He's like 5'0". He's, I think, 5'4" is his actual height. He's not a real big guy. So he probably feels very physically outmatched by being in the presence of, sailors and some of the bigger guys. So I wonder how much of that might have just been for his own comfort, trying to stay a little physically stronger just so he doesn't feel like as much of a weakling, I guess. Also, at this time, he and Bartlett are becoming quite close, and Bartlett is constantly telling him, well, I bet that, I didn't think you could do it. You're finally, looking like a sailor instead of a school teacher, and things to that effect. So I think that he likes it when the captain, references how well he's fitting in and how well he's doing. So we're going to do more of that. It kind of makes sense that he would want to make Bartlett proud of him. That's something that comes up quite a bit in his journal. At this point, as they are becoming more friendly, he really does want Bartlett to be proud of him. And if he can do that by trying to increase his own physical fitness and getting stronger and staying ready for whatever comes next, then it makes sense that he would do that, because it's not like he has a whole lot else to do.
So by the end of November, Bartlett estimates that their position is about 150 to 170 miles east of, is it usually pronounced Wrangel Island?
Wrangel Island, yes.
About 150 to 175 miles east of Wrangel Island, meaning that they had drifted about 300 miles in the past 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
So around this time, there's some more dredging, some more fun specimens. Murray manages to bag an octopus, which is something that, they know what it is. But he also put 11 specimens of previously unknown animal life. And I'm fascinated by what these were, and I don't think I'll ever get to find out.
It's very unfortunate that it appears that all of Murray's specimens did go down with the ship, which I don't think at this point is a spoiler to say the ship is going to go down. And most of the scientific work and the specimens went down with it. Now, in the article, the Cavell article, she does allude to the fact that there may have been some records that made it off the ship. I don't know. There hasn't been, again, that article just came out earlier this year. That's brand new scholarship. So I don't know if anybody has responded to that or anything, but the idea is that the overwhelming majority of the scholarship did go down with the ship. So we don't know what the 11 species were, and unless they pull an endurance and go find the Karluk, it's unlikely that we will ever know.
So here's a way back connection for listeners who remember the San Pedro de Alcantara, that ship that was sailing from Peru or Chile, and it was sailing and it wrecked off the coast of Portugal. We also had a situation there where you had my precious samples. Mm-hmm. What has happened to them? So yes, this is not the first time we've lost a bunch of precious samples in a wreck on the show.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate. I would love to know what kind of stuff he was pulling out of the water there. Let's see. So the next big waypoint or milestone, if you're looking at your calendar on board here, you've got Christmas coming up here, something that a lot of these guys are going to be looking forward to. The 21st of December would be Arctic midnight. So halfway until the sun is going to be back. They've got about 6 more weeks here. So as much as possible, trying to make it a Christmas like any other. Europeans, white folks will try to find any way possible to celebrate Christmas, even in the worst situations. I mean, look at Christmas 1914. You had your Christmas truce and football games and stuff like that. We'll try to celebrate Christmas anytime possible, and this is no different. So they've got to get stuff going. They've got to get decorations. They've got to get some food and drink prepared. I know that, is it Templeman, the cook?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I know he was whipping up some cakes, some special stuff for Christmas. There's some gifts being exchanged, which is an interesting part here. So Kadektovik and Karluk both receive hunting knives and watches from Bartlett. For Kiruk, Auntie, she gets a cotton dress, talcum powder, soap, a looking glass, a comb, and a brush. And then even little Helen and Mugpi, they both get dresses, which is nice to include the kids in that too.
Yeah. And that's I know that we talk a lot about how a lot of these guys were horrifically racist, and they were, but I think that an area where they shine is they always really did try to look out for and protect the kids who were on this expedition. Even when things get really dark, they did always do their best to make sure that the kids were protected and supported.
And that is one thing, and I think that's almost why I think reading through the end stages of this story, I kind of at times forgot there were children there.
Yeah,
which is a good thing, I guess, to show that they're being taken care of. They're not struggling to survive as much as they would in other situations. That at least is good. The dogs, not a good part of the story. The children and the cat.
Yeah, the children and the cat. Yeah, the good parts. The children, and of course, they had both of their parents there to look out for them, and their parents were, of course, their primary caregivers and protectors. But it was kind of heartwarming to see and the men still did some things, that were not ideal towards the indigenous people at various points in the story. But to the best of my knowledge, everybody was pretty protective and supportive of the kids.
Okay, and maybe the most interesting part of their Christmas Day festivities, they have a nice little sporting program put together with a nice variety of stuff here.
Yeah, like a track meet.
We've got 100-yard dash. We've got the long jump, both standing and running. We've got a sack race, the high jump, the three-legged race, shot put, or putting the weight, as it's referred to in the program. 50-yard burst. I don't know if that's different than a 50-yard dash.
I think it's a 50-yard dash.
I think
sounds
like it would be the same. Hop, step, and leap, tug of war, an obstacle race, and of course wrestling. And Bartlett, keeping an eye out for his group's morale, he asks Mayman to pick two. Mayman being the best athlete, he's a champion skier. If he enters all of these, there's a chance he wins all of these. And Bartlett wants to spread the love around a little bit, so he says, "Hey, Mayman, pick two." I don't remember which two he picked.
I think the long jumps, but I could be wrong.
There isn't a skiing competition, so
there is not a skiing competition. But it ended up that a nice mix of people ended up winning the events. So I think that was a very good decision on Bartlett's part to try to spread the joy around and give some other people a chance to be successful.
Which is cool. I mean, that's very similar to a teaching situation where, as a teacher, sometimes it's nice to have that student who is always ready to answer, always wants to speak. But at the same time, you can't just let that student run with it. You've got to find ways to sort of subtly deflect that student's energy other ways, or get other students involved in the discussion. So I felt a connection with Bartlett there.
Yeah.
On the morning of the 26th, the ice around the Karluk cracked loudly, with a large fracture opening up along the ship's starboard side. For now, the ship is keeping her hull integrity, and that leak is not getting worse. But Bartlett is starting to see where this is going. He orders everyone to be ready to abandon ship if necessary. Also, the aforementioned Molly, Hadley's pet, she gives birth to a litter of 11 puppies, most of whom it sounds like survived, at least the birth, which is not always the case with puppies.
Yeah.
So a few days later, around midday on the 29th, they sight land. But which land is one of the questions we could ask here, or a question that has been asked. And I read through that Cavell article, and there's a lot of stuff I'd like to include from it in mostly in part 3, but kind of in general, the question here, and I don't have a good feel for how firmly established is it which land they're actually seeing here.
Well, The problem is that they don't know either. They are having some trouble with their navigational equipment. The ship's chronometer is not accurate, and that is a thing that they use to try to gauge, the time that it takes to get from one point to another and how far they've drifted. So they don't have a completely accurate sense of where they are, because Wrangel Island and not Herschel Island. What's the other one? Herald Island, yes. So Wrangel Island and Herald Island are fairly close to one another, but you've got Herald Island first and then Wrangel Island. And Wrangel Island is significantly larger than Herald Island. So the question is, have they already passed Herald Island and are they approaching Wrangel, or are they approaching Herald and they can't tell? So it is not... They're not in a position where they can really tell where they are. They just know that they've seen land. So the question is, who do we believe? Because at this time, George Malloch is the one operating the chronometer, and he is got a better sense than the others of how accurate it might be. And he says, well, based on the chronometer reading, I think that we're actually coming up on Herald Island. But some of the other crew have said, well, I think that the chronometer is actually more wrong than Malloch thinks it is. And I think that we've actually passed Herald and are coming up on Wrangel. So there's this dispute between Malloch, who is saying, I'm pretty sure that we're coming up on Herald, and some of the other people, including Bartlett, who seem to believe we're actually coming up on Wrangel. So there wasn't a set opinion among the crew. In reality, they were coming up on Herald and Wrangel was still further off.
I think that part of this highlights some of the challenges of something seemingly simple, I think, to someone who's never had to do it, something like identifying which island this is. Because if you look at a map, Herald and Wrangel look very different. They're very different sizes. Mm-hmm. I know topographically they're quite different. Herald has these more sheer cliff faces around the side that would make it much harder to actually get to. And so I think looking on a map, you'd wonder, how could you possibly not know? Whereas this kind of shows that even people who have the instruments and know what they're looking at, more or less, have trouble identifying which island they're actually coming to, which is good to remember. It looks easy on paper when you're reading about it.
And it's very interesting to me that it was never a question of, is the chronometer right or wrong? It is, how wrong is the chronometer?
Right.
Is it extremely wrong, or is it just a little wrong? There was no certainty in this instrument. So it was just a matter of, is this only a little bit wrong, or is it very, very wrong? And which set of figures do you go with based on your belief on how wrong the chronometer is?
So that the Cavell article talks more about that, and I think we already mentioned a little bit about that, and I like that article because that was the first real detailed other take on Bartlett in general on it, whereas the prevailing narrative is fairly sympathetic to Bartlett. That article takes a much more critical tone of some of those decisions and why Bartlett was doing some of these things, some of the records and the journals, and saying, well, how much can we really trust this when it's been sort of rewritten and possibly re-remembered? So yeah, I definitely know that we'll talk more about that article in our next part. For now, the ship is still relatively safe, and New Year's is coming around. And there's a fun line, I think this is from Empire of Ice and Stone, where it says, "It was a quiet evening, at least until the Scots got involved." I know New Year's Eve is particularly important in Scotland, so this is a big deal for the Scots. At some point in the drinking and carousing and celebrating, enough boasting is happening here that a football match is scheduled for the next day. The Scots say that they could take on all comers and win a soccer match here against this team, this all nations team remaining. My favorite part of this was that they had Karluk, I believe, as the goalie for the all nations team.
And she was a pretty good goalie considering the all nations team won by a pretty large margin. So good for her.
She only gave up 3 goals, which
she did.
In a pro soccer context, okay, that's not great. But here, when her team is scoring 8, that's really all you need.
Yeah.
So yeah, like Karluk was a pretty good goaltender, it seems.
Mm-hmm. I'm proud of her.
Especially a game that I'm assuming she might not be overly familiar with, and I don't know, maybe not played before. The premise of playing goalie, I guess, on its face is pretty simple.
Yeah. And I think too, in defense of Scotland a tiny bit, this was New Year's Day. I'm going to guess everybody was more than a little hungover, and that the All Scotland team was maybe hampered by their impairment of the night before. So there might have been a slightly different outcome had they played a few days later.
Not ideal soccer conditions, probably. Your guys aren't conditioned for this one. It's rough, a rough way to play a game. There's also a very touching little moment here where McKinley and Bartlett, you kind of mentioned their bond growing closer, and one of the things they bond over is roses and gardening.
Yeah.
McKinley sees this book, a book about roses by Samuel Reynolds Hole. With that name, I have to wonder if he's related to the folklore writer Christina Hole. It's a very unique last name.
It is, yes.
And talking about some of these discussions that they have here, it is a very sort of like, it's a very disjointed sort of thing. You're in this frozen Arctic landscape, and the conversation goes to, talking about gardening and life and growth and, these different types of flowers and how to take care of them and how to make sure that they grow. And it's such a cool sort of disparity between the situation they're in and the situation that they're sort of imagining for back home.
Mm-hmm.
And so on some of these discussions, McKinley wrote,
"They took our minds off our present problems, kept us from looking in on ourselves, reminded us that there was still a familiar world that we would return to if we just kept our heads and took things calmly."
So as a way to sort of keep some sort of contact with the outside world, even just remembering that there is an outside world that you can go back to once you get out of this mess. So on the morning of January 10th, the ice around Karluk becomes very active. It's crashing against the hull of the vessel. It splits apart the dredge house that they've put together, I believe off the stern of the ship. This is where they were taking those dredgings and those soundings. Karluk develops a port list of about 25 degrees. Bartlett, he continues his efforts to lighten the ship in hopes of saving her, but the fatal blow comes around 7 that night. Her hull is punctured by what's described as a large fang of ice on the port side, and water starts flooding into her engine room, which is usually the death knell of any ship we talk about. Once you start, filling up your engine room with water.
Sure.
Bartlett's got no choice but to return to deck and order all hands abandon ship. By 11 that night, the engine room was totally underwater, and really the only thing keeping Karluk, quote unquote, afloat is the fact that she's being pressed by this ice. Mm-hmm. If that's not there, she's probably already sinking at this point. With everyone now on the ice, along with any of the stuff they've been able to offload, including the cat at the last...
Yes, including the cat.
Last minute, they're looking for the cat, and they managed to find her, right?
Yeah, they were concerned. Yeah, it's a girl cat. They were concerned because at first they couldn't find the cat, and they were very, the cat had become sort of their mascot. Unlike the dogs, the cat was very cuddly and enjoyed spending time with the crew, so they all were sort of bonded to her. But Fred Maurer was the one who had really kind of taken on responsibility for her. So as the ship is slowly going down, they're searching the ship, trying to find the cat. They do eventually find her. She's kind of hiding, in one of those little hidey holes that cats are fond of getting into. They rescue the cat. They get her off the ship. And then you have this extremely dramatic scene of Bartlett on the ship as it's going down. If Bjarne Mayman is an emo kid, Bartlett is a theater kid. He has a real flair for the dramatic. And I love this scene of everything's off the ship, everybody's off the ship. And so now Bob goes back on the ship as it very slowly sinks, and he parks himself in front of the Victrola. And he has all of these records in front of him. And he's in front of the Victrola, but he's also in front of the stove. So he will play a record and then he'll toss it in the stove. He does not really care for jazz, so he plays that first, plays all those jazz records, tosses them in the stove, goes through the records one by one, plays them, tosses them in the stove, watches them burn. The very last record that he plays right before he's getting ready to depart the ship is Chopin's Funeral March. He puts on the funeral march. He gets up. He waits until the ship has sunk down to the point where he can just sort of step off level with the ice, walks off the ship. The Canadian ensign is flying high, and they all stand together on the ice and watch the ship go down as Chopin's funeral march plays in the background as it sinks.
Such a cinematic scene.
It really is.
It's really, I appreciate that because it's very cool, I think, to put on that level of show for like really not that many people, really committed to the bit.
Yeah.
It's a cool place to end this section of the story, at least for the men and women who are on or off the Karluk now, I guess.
Off the Karluk, yes.
We're at the point now where we actually do get our sinking itself for our shipwreck podcast. We finally do have our shipwreck that everybody's been waiting for. So if you've been listening to this episode, maybe you've been wondering, what is Stefansson up to? Because obviously he's not there. Where is he? What's he doing? What's he got planned in his little mind? What is going on? So Jess, if you I don't know if you want to give us a summary or just a quick rundown of what is Steph up to? What's he been doing?
I would love to. So the Karluk has just gone down, and Steph is, of course, nowhere to be found because he has left the ship several days before, and he is off kind of doing his thing. Where he ends up...
Can I just interject one more thing?
Yes.
Because it connects back to the cat, and people will forget about it otherwise. Yes. I did want to say that the image of the finally tracking down Nikki, the cat, just in time and getting her off safely, that is such a cat owner thing of, having to deal with, you're desperately searching for a cat.
Yes.
And you manage to find them somewhere that like maybe they don't normally hang out, but it's not it's not an inherently weird spot for them to be. And you find them and everything's fine. You had a few moments of panic, like did they get out? What happened to them? And they're here. They've been in your house the whole time. We had this like the week that we moved to our new place, a lot of new places for cats to be, lots of stuff where it's not supposed to be, lots of places to hide. And I was standing in line at the grocery store, and Katie texted me that she thinks Winston has gotten out because she can't find him anywhere. She's been shaking treats. He's not showing up anywhere. Can't find him. And so I happened to say, did you check on top of the cabinets by the fridge? And she did. Sure enough, he's there. It's this section of our house that it is a very, very narrow gap between the cabinet and the ceiling. It is narrow enough that Winston could get himself up, but not down, because there's no space for him to jump. And so he would do this multiple times. He'd go up there, he'd get himself stuck, and he would just sit up there silently because he could not get down. And it was like, how many times do we have to go through this? Like Winston, you cannot do this every single time. But yes, I thought about being a cat person and how cat person that is. Like, of course, when you need to really find them is the time you cannot.
I can just feel their panic because, the ship is going down. There is not going to be an opportunity to come back and look for the cat again. And they were terrified that they were going to have to leave her on the ship and that she would go down with the ship. So I can really appreciate that panic because I've been in similar situations. I have cats as well, especially every time that my husband and I go out of town. Whenever we get back, we have one cat that is our little scared boy that will hide for an entire day. And whenever we come home, I can't relax until I see that my cats are okay, that all the animals are okay. So I will drive myself crazy looking around the house, trying to find this cat. And eventually he will emerge just with no shame whatsoever, come out of wherever he's been hiding. And I can just picture, little Nikki, I think she was up in the rafters somewhere. So she was maybe hiding in the ceiling, and they finally find her, get her off the ship just in the nick of time. And the entire crew just breathes a sigh of relief. That is a universal cat person emotion.
Especially because there was also, I know, a close call with Molly earlier where they had to basically leave her on the ice because, the flow is breaking up or something.
Yeah.
And they sort of go back to the ship with the thought that Molly is just gone. And then the next morning, Molly just comes back.
And that's an interesting thing with the way that the ice kind of breaks up into flows and then comes back together. So Molly had gotten separated from the group. And so she was by herself on an ice flow. And Mayman wrote something stereotypically Mayman about, she nothing but suffering ahead of her now as she dies slowly alone on the ice floe, or something else extremely emo and typical of Mayman. So the entire crew is really down because everybody really likes Molly and everybody's sad that, presumably she won't be coming back. Well, sure enough, that floe of ice that she was on managed to hook up with another floe of ice, and there were enough pieces of ice coming together that she was able to make it back across, and then she shows up a couple days later. So they've had a couple close calls with those two animals.
And I guess, yeah, it does help that Molly is a sled dog.
Yes.
She's kind of built for these. She's not like a Pomeranian accidentally stuck on the ice.
No. No, she's not a little chihuahua up there. She's built for the climate, for sure.
All right, so the last thing I wanted to get here in part 2 is we don't want to go a whole episode without knowing where Steph is and what he's up to. So what has he been doing? What is that guy up to? What's his next scheme?
So Steph, the last time that we caught up with Steph, he had abandoned the Karluk and he was off going on a quote unquote, air quotes, hunting expedition. Well, during that time, he discovered that there was a big storm, and so he wasn't able to see where the Karluk was anymore. It wasn't where she left her because she had drifted several hundred miles. So he and his little crew go into Alaska, and they find out where the southern party is located. So Steph and this crew that he has with him just show up at the southern party's home base. And, what an unpleasant surprise, because if you remember back earlier in the first episode, the scientific team almost came to blows with Steph and almost left the expedition because they were and the only thing that smoothed all that over was that they were told if they agree to stay on, that the Southern Party will be under the exclusive control of Dr. Anderson, and Steph will not have any say in the Southern Party's activities whatsoever. So imagine their surprise when Steph shows up with his crew of guys, and he says, "So hey, we lost the Karluk. We don't know where it is, but I got to get back up north. I gotta keep looking for land. I gotta study the Copper Inuit. I got stuff to do. So I'm just gonna take your ship, and I'm gonna take your supplies, and I'm just gonna head up north." And you can imagine how well this was received by the Southern Party, who said absolutely not. So they get into it. Steph and Dr. Anderson get into it yet again. Eventually, it is decided that he's going to take some of the supplies. He does leave the Southern Party's ship alone. And the reason that he's able to do that is because he has what essentially amounts to a blank checkbook from the Canadian government to use in case of emergency. So instead of taking their ship, he decides to preserve the peace and not take their ship. He does take some of the supplies, but he takes this blank checkbook and he goes out and gets himself his own ship. And some of the guys that he was with end up staying with the Southern Party. Some of them go north with him. He gets a new crew of guys. He gets a new ship, and he goes right back up into the Arctic to start the work again. Because remember, in his mind, the work is more important than the lives of the crew, the lives of the scientist, or the ship. So he assumes that they're either dead or lost to him. He does not spend any amount of time worrying about where they are or what might have become of them, because he knows that there's nothing that he can do about it in this moment. Although there were things he could do about it, he just kind of chose not to. But he knows that his work is the thing that's going to be most important. So he gets a new crew, a new ship, take that blank check from the Canadian government, gets everything he needs, and heads back up north. And that is where he will be for the next few years.
Because the blank checks, I think, were mentioned fairly early in like the fact that they existed. And then seeing him use them, I was sort of expecting those, if they got used, I was expecting it to be like, needing to buy like supplies or something, so he'd have to spend I don't know $500 or something, and he ends up writing these two,
or I don't know, a rescue mission for the Karluk crew, maybe that would be a good use of the blank checks.
That could do it. I guess I wasn't expecting him to use them for such big amounts. He ends up writing checks for what I think like $6,000 and $13,000.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, hey, if you got a blank check, use it, especially one from the government of Canada.
Yeah. This expedition goes phenomenally over budget. It is absolutely absurdly over budget, and giving Steph a blank checkbook is exactly why it is so over budget.
So yeah, that was interesting. I liked the parts where Steph is sort of going back, trying to get back somewhere that he can get off the ground again, and he's running into people he knows. And actually, that part really did highlight how he does have a lot of connections. He knows a lot of people in this area, different, people on the ground, traders, things like that. And, some of them are saying, well, hey, what brings you back so soon? I thought I wasn't going to see you for like 3 years.
Yeah.
So we know Steph is somewhat back in the game here with his new ship, new crew. And I think that's probably a good place to end part 2. So we've sort of triangulated around to say that this will be 4 main parts to this episode. And then we'll have that bonus because after the Karluk expedition, Stefansson's not done.
Oh, no.
Not by a long shot. We will get around to all of that. So yeah, for part 2, again, thanks, Jess, for all of this. I mean, you wrote like half or more of the notes for this one. So thanks for all of that.
No problem. Happy to help. And
yeah, thanks for helping us through all of this. We've got a lot more fun. Well, fun for us, not fun for
fun. Air quotes.
Not fun for our subjects here. Next episode is when things are really going to start to get pretty bleak.
Yeah.
We'll deal with that when it happens. So if you have been with us up through this point, thank you so much for listening. We hope you're enjoying this one, and we look forward to getting deeper into the story. So talk to you again soon, and take care.